Today I'm going to share with you my literacy strategy portfolio, and the strategy I'm going to share is called Question the Author. This strategy provides students with an opportunity to engage with the text by asking thoughtful questions about what the author is saying and why. Instead of just reading the story, students pause to consider the author's message, word choices, and purpose for including specific details. This strategy that I'm sharing today, I'm thinking that would be modeled with a first grade classroom, but this strategy can be used across all grade levels. And this strategy, Questioning the Author, was shared with me years ago. Although I don't recall the original source, I was looking for some information on it, so I found a helpful resource on Reading Rockets that provides an overview and guidance for using this strategy in the classroom. Today, we're going to read a part of If You Had Your Birthday Party on the Moon. The author tells us what it would be like to float in space. As we read, we're going to stop and ask questions, just like detectives, to figure out what the author wants us to understand. Our goal is to think about what the author is saying and why. When we ask the author questions, we become stronger readers and thinkers. Their learning objectives today are that students will ask and answer questions to better understand what the author is telling them. Students will identify new vocabulary words that help them learn about space, and students will share ideas about what happens when there is no gravity. Nonfiction books, like If You Had Your Birthday Party on the Moon, often have a glossary at the back. A glossary is like a mini dictionary that helps us understand new or tricky words. Let's look. Here's the word gravity. It tells us what gravity means. Gravity, a force that pulls people and objects towards the ground. When I'm not sure what a science word means, I can check out the glossary. In my classroom, I would also be looking for opportunities to respond while using this text. So for example, where do we find the glossary? In the front or the back of the book, and I would expect a choral response. Another one would be, what kind of book usually has a glossary? Fiction or nonfiction? I could use thumbs up or thumbs down. And then I could also have students point to a word in the glossary and we could read it together. Now that we know how to use the glossary, let's go back to our story and see how these words appear while we read. Here are some words to know before we read. Float, gravity, spacesuit, weightless. When I'd be introducing these words together, I would do an Anita Archer style type of routine of, let's say these words together. For example, say gravity. The students would repeat it. Gravity is what keeps us on the ground. When I drop my pencil, gravity pulls it down. Would gravity make you float or fall? And then for an opportunity to respond, I would use a thumbs up or thumbs down. Another one would be, say weightless. Weightless means there's no gravity pulling you down. You float. Model floating with the arms and have the students do it too. And then I would continue with the rest of the words using quick examples and responses. Given our limited time for this assignment, we'll start on page 2 and will not read every page of the book. Once your ship is coasting through space, everyone at your party will be weightless. Just unbuckle your seatbelt and you'll start to float, surrounded by party hats, presents, and your piñata. Let's stop and think. The author says everyone will be weightless. What is the author trying to tell us here? She wants us to imagine what it feels like to float because there's no gravity. Why did she tell us about party hats and presents floating? Maybe she wants us to picture how different space is from Earth. This is where I would offer a time for students to have some choral response or even partner share for student thoughts. This is the strategy called Questioning the Author. So for the sake of time, I set up this page, but I typically wouldn't have all 3 speech bubbles out at the same time. But the questions that I would ask the students are, what is the author trying to tell us? Why did the author say this part, and does this make sense? So I would have the students look closely at this picture and read what the author wrote. And then I would be waiting for some student responses. So for example, what is the author trying to tell us about being in space? Why did the author describe the party this way? Does this make sense? How can people float? What do we learn about gravity from this part? So then I would tell the students that we're going to ask the author some questions. So the questions that we could come up with is, what is the author trying to tell us about being in space? Why do you think she included floating presents and piñatas? Does it make sense that you could float upside down and still be safe? Why or why not? For the next part of our discussion, we would talk about what happens when there's no gravity. I would have an image to share with the students of astronauts floating. And then what I would have talked to them about is here's what it really looks like. These astronauts are floating because there's no gravity pulling them down. The author wants us to imagine that our party guests would be floating just like this. Part of the discussion I would then ask is, how would it feel to be weightless? What would happen to your birthday cake? I've skipped ahead a few pages for this assignment, but we would do this activity part together, and really we'd ask the author, what is the author trying to tell us about life in space? How would it be different than on Earth? So we're going to reread the part about floating upside down, and then what's the author trying to tell us about being up and down? Yes, in space, there's no up or down because there's no gravity. The author uses fun birthday ideas to help us imagine it. I would suggest using a graphic template. I believe that it's best for reinforcing the strategy of questioning the author. So you explicitly want to teach or review the whole process. So I would have this visual organizer. Typically in primary, I like to do it with the students, but it can also be an independent activity. So when we do questioning the author, we want to stop and think. First, we notice what the author says. Then we ask our question. And then finally, we think about what it means. So for example, why this works is that it reinforces the process of questioning the author, QTA. It's great for modeling thinking aloud explicitly, and it can become a reusable anchor chart for future lessons. I showed you the graphic template, but I also wanted to show you one that could possibly look like filled out. So for example, the question would be as a group we'd come up with, what's the author saying? Like everyone will be weightless. So then the question would maybe possibly be, why are they floating? And then what you think is because there's no gravity. Or another one might be the author is telling us there's no up or down. The question could be, how can that be? And then what I think is because space doesn't have the same gravity as Earth. At the end of the lesson, I always like to do a review of things that we've learned. So the first couple of thoughts that come to mind, I would come up with, what did we learn about gravity? What happens when you're weightless? And then how did questioning the author help us understand? So we would review together, and what did we learn about gravity? I would hope that the students would be able to share that gravity pulls things down. Without it, we float. And then how did asking the author questions help us? I would hope that it would come up that it helped us make sense of what she wanted us to imagine and learn with the story. Using the question the author strategy doesn't need a lot of resources, but the things that you would need would be your textbook, the graphic template, some vocabulary picture cards or word wall cards. For this lesson, we used gravity, weightless, float, astronaut, a variety of words, real or toy items for demonstration purposes. I really like to use a lot of opportunities to respond tools. So if you use those things, then it would just be things that you've pre-taught with your classroom. And then some optional extension materials would be a wonder wall setup, having a chart paper labeled our moon wonders, sticky notes for students to either write things down or draw their pictures, and then space or moon images for inspiration. You'd also need to use like some pencils or crayons if you're using this as a whole group activity or independent work. So based on what your needs are. Thanks for watching and listening today. I hope you picked up a new strategy or were reminded of a strategy with Question the Author, and that you're excited to try it out with your students. Please feel free to reach out anytime with questions. I'm happy to help support you. I think it's a great strategy. Thanks.